I'd like to spend a few minutes now talking about justice with respect to issues, crimes committed during violent conflict. And I want to contrast my experiences of justice between the Balkans and East Timor. Many people died in both places relative to the size of the populations. It was a socially traumatic experience in both cases. So, as you know, the international community set up an international criminal tribunal, ICTY, for the former Yugoslavia to try the worst of the war crimes. The huge mass of crimes that were not covered, and I'm talking hundreds of thousands of them, to this day remain unanswered and unspoken for. And my primary comment about the criminal tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is that what it did well, but what it did was nowhere near enough. And what was really sad was at the time when we were talking about, and I was a senior fellow at the United States Institute of Peace when this was being done, the US Institute of Peace was able and willing and able to fund a people's history. We don't talk about truth commissions anymore. We talk about a people's history, where you visit various very, very small localities and you just ask people to come and say what they saw happened, which day it happened, and whatever. And you get an oral people's history. One of the things all victims and all traumatized people need is to say what happened to them and have someone else, preferably someone who's impartial, listen to what they said. Just the act of being able to say and being listened to it's not sufficient, but it's a great start. Sadly, tragically, the persons in charge of the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia told the US Institute of Peace they did not want a people's history to be done because they did not want time, effort and resources diverted from their important work to something else which would be at a village level. It was a massive mistake and almost unforgivable. So, let us look at the bare bones, the facts of ICTY. The tribunal cost $1.2 billion. It indicted 161 individuals. And I am going to repeat, there were hundreds of thousands. Every single group, faction, ethnicity had its own small number of criminals. It's a fact. However, those who have the best armies, those who have the best weapons, those who have the best logistics, have more opportunity to commit crimes. It's not that their hearts are any blacker. It's that when you have a black heart and you have lots of opportunity, you do it. That's the reality. Okay. As you can see here, 111 trials completed by ICTY, 161 indicted and 111 brought to trial. 90 convicted, less than 100. These are supposed to be crimes against humanity, crimes of a breathtaking nature. 90 convicted. For the rest, the acquittals, the transferred to other national jurisdictions, and the final cost, 7 years, $1.2 billion. Part of this problem is there was a sense, and where it came from I am not sure, that the Nuremberg tribunals were crude. They lasted typically 4 to 6 weeks. It was more or less the clerk of the court shouting, "Wheel the guilty person in." A tribunal of judges questioned. Yes, there was a defense function. A lawyer provided defense, but essentially it was a pretty wham bam sort of affair. Given the horror of what was done in the Balkans, and given that these are exceptional crimes, these are crimes against humanity, even serial killers don't get into crimes against humanity. It should not have been dressed up as a conventional court with prosecutors and defenders. Why? The prosecutors were all loaned from governments or paid at a certain scale. The defense was able to bring in the best people in their camp. The defense lawyers ran rings around and obscured and obfuscated the prosecution lawyers. That's what you get when you model it on a classical, particularly common law experience, that it's just about, a company chief financial officer who's run away with a few $1 million. This wasn't those kind of crimes. You didn't get there unless the evidence was known to hundreds, even thousands of people. Okay, so that's the raw data on ICTY. Here are some of the people. The two best known war criminals. One is Radovan Karadzic, the other is Ratko Mladic. I don't intend to say anything any more about them, but if you haven't heard of them, then I'm not actually sure why you're watching this video. This next one you probably haven't heard. This guy is called Slavko Dokmanovic. I met him many times, both towards the end of the conflict and immediately after the conflict. He was the mayor of Vukovar. He was implicated totally in the taking of, or the ordering of, or the organizing of taking 200 wounded prisoners of war and having them summarily executed and dumped in a mass grave. He was a small, solid, boastful peacock of a guy who gradually, as he felt the long arm of the law getting closer to him, became less and less of a peacock and rather more and more of a mouse. He was grabbed by the special police, the Polish special police, and he was taken off to The Hague. I had left the region by the time he was grabbed. Some time later, when I was in another job, I heard that he had committed suicide in his cell at The Hague. And that struck me as being curious, because knowing him as I did, I didn't see him as the suicide type. There were others who committed suicide at The Hague who had gone to great lengths to get sophisticated kit to them because they wouldn't accept the tribunal's judgment. And they were that kind of character. Slavko was not. But Slavko was defended by a very, very well-known and well-financed firm from Belgrade. And Belgrade at that time was run by a guy called Slobodan Milosevic. And I can't help drawing some lines between the desire not to have anything said in court that might further embarrass the greatest Serb, is how Milosevic liked to be referred to. And people like Dokmanovic were League 2 or League 3 Serbs. Anyway, that's my conjecture. Some of you will have got the sense that I feel bitterly disappointed and let down by what the tribunal did, that it had extraordinary things to do and did them in a very ordinary and expensive way. And that was all I have to say about that. The next kind of justice I want to talk about is traditional justice in East Timor. Elsewhere I've covered the subject of the blood feud, and that is a difficult thing to deal with, simply because whatever action is taken can spark a further reaction. And certainly I would encourage the Timorese to look at non-traditional methods of stopping blood feuds and of having a criminal code that covers physical injury and especially death in a way that doesn't allow for retribution, or if retribution is taken, it's treated as a crime as well. And that is for sure. But everything except for blood is done at the village level, and it's done in a manner that we would recognize in more industrial societies as alternate dispute resolution. In other words, there's a village meeting, the person who's accused stands up and admits what they've done, and then everybody gets a chance to tell them off. And I've seen old grannies stand up and say to someone, you were a bad boy when you were 6 and you came and stole my whatever and you did this and you and those other boys set fire to that. And you're thinking, what has this got to do with anything? And the answer is, in that village, it's got to do with everything. Everybody knows the stories. Everybody knows essentially what has been done. Everybody knows the victim. Everybody knows the crime. And so long as it's all agreed by nightfall, and this was their thing, they would talk all day, but by nightfall, the list of reparations had been spoken out loud and agreed, and the next day the guy set about making those reparations. It was fast, it was local, everybody had a say that was affected, because the whole village is affected when a crime is committed. And after a while, the sort of completely ragtag and higgledy-piggledy nature of it, not only did it not upset me, I could see that it fitted. For that hand, that glove fitted. For that village, that outcome fitted. Because those villages had to be tight. You all had lots of food together, or you all starved together. That's the village thing. It's a form, and it was really, if you look at it as alternate dispute resolution, is really quite sophisticated, really quite impressive. Even though from time to time, when I was listening to some of this stuff, I could barely stop from laughing because it sounded so incongruous. Yet to them, it was what they did, it was what their grandparents had done, their great-grandparents, their forebears way back to whichever migration they had landed in. From the time they landed in Timor, they started to develop these small villages and these village procedures. And it was a patchwork quilt, and it didn't need to be written down. It was understood in the villages. And to be honest, as a way of dealing with everything except the blood feud, it was outstanding. And all that the Timorese need to do is to graft in something that can help stop the pendulum nature of the blood feud, and they will have an outstanding justice system. So, there were 3 categories of perpetrators in Timor, as you can see here. Clean hands. If you were just a witness, you were one of a group of boys and you'd been with them and you hadn't done anything, you'd just been there, stood around, you were considered to have clean hands, and that was it. You weren't held accountable for anything. If your mum smacked you around the side of the head when you got home, that's a different story. But as far as the village was concerned, clean hands, go home. The dirty hands, stole, broke, burnt, criminal damage, that sort of thing. That's where I'm talking about the village meeting. The problem is the bloody hands, which is the blood feud, which they didn't deal with well, because the only thing that they would do was say, if he's caused blood in your family, you have to go and cause blood in his. And that really, as I say, leads to just a never-ending string of reprisals. So that's where that goes wrong. So let's look at Cynefin for these kinds of ideas about criminality and the law. In the obvious domain, we have written law, customary practice in the villages, police and courts and investigative procedures. These are all obvious things. They are not the end in themselves. They are enabling. And it's very important when we talk about in the international community doing police reform. Immediately they want to talk about uniforms, natures of restraint, the size of the baton that the police are going to carry. These are the obvious things that are easy to measure and easy to do and often utterly irrelevant. They're not what causes people to respect justice or to obey the law. The new law, international law, such as the Genocide Convention, this is complicated. It requires all sorts of international experts to sit around, because if you think about human rights, there really are cultural differences in what constitutes a grave breach of human rights and just a regular breach of human rights. There is in every society a sense of what is just, and there is also a great temptation from those who come from well-financed communities and well-financed cultures to want to apply standards that less well-resourced communities simply can't live up to. However, the idea and principles of alternative dispute resolution are really impressive, and they should be borrowed by industrial societies from traditional societies. And traditional societies would do well to borrow the court proceedings for those crimes which they cannot deal with in their excellent traditional way. And as I've said many times, that includes the blood feud. The issue, coming back to ICTY, I've got to say it here. In the eyes of the majority of Bosnians that I know, ICTY was an incredible disappointment. It held up hope for justice. It did not deliver. It delivered mechanical, legalistic, extended, expensive court proceedings on a tiny number of people when a huge number of people were affected. It consciously blocked all kinds of efforts at reconciliation, like the people's history. It was, and I'm sure that this is not very popular with some of you, it was, in my opinion, a disaster. And it was a disaster because it was handed off to the lawyers, and the lawyers organized it the only way they could, in the same way as a civilized, ordinary civil proceeding or criminal proceeding in their own country. They did not understand the unique nature. They did not really hoist on board their definition, crimes against humanity. They didn't understand that exceptional and extraordinary circumstances required an exceptional and extraordinary vision. What were you trying to achieve? 100,000 died in Bosnia. They started with 4.5 million. So, that's all I have to say about that. And if you don't like it, well, that's just too bad.